Greetings and welcome to today's webinar, the COVID-19 vaccine, your questions and our answers. My name is Joe Macbeth and I'm the President and CEO of the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals. We are doing today's webinar based on your concerns about the COVID-19 vaccine. We've been monitoring our Facebook page and our social media accounts. And we know that there's a lot of questions, a lot of concern about the COVID vaccine. So we decided to go to the experts. Joining us today is our National Medical Advisor, Dr. Rick Rader, who's done several of our webinars around the COVID-19 pandemic, and a biochemist named Macbeth, who also happens to be my younger and much smarter brother. So welcome, Dr. Rader and Dr. Macbeth. John, let me just go over the agenda for today. We have you for an hour. We're going to take our time. We're going to be thoughtful and deliberate in our answers. After I get done with some opening remarks and a little bit of context, John is going to moderate the discussion. John Raphael, thank you very much. He'll start by introducing Dr. Rader and Dr. Macbeth. Then Mark is going to give us a little bit of a science behind the human immune system and the vaccines and RNA, just to kind of set the table for your questions so we can get the facts out of the way. Then we're going to get into your questions. When you signed up for this webinar, you were given the opportunity to send us a question. We got your questions. We got a lot of questions. We were able to consolidate a lot of them into different areas. There was a lot of repeat questions. I think we know what the main questions are. So we're going to spend some time answering your questions. And then we're going to close this webinar with a call to action about our code of ethics and acting with professional responsibility and integrity. So that's the agenda. Let me just start by why we're doing this today, the why of today. About a week ago, there was a very prominent article in the New York Times. It was called Cash, Breakfast, and Firings, an all-out push to vaccinate weary medical workers. In that really great article, the first two paragraphs consolidated exactly what we've been seeing on our Facebook page. I'm going to read the first paragraph for you. Anxious about taking a new vaccine and scarred by a history of being mistreated, many frontline workers, including direct support professionals, are balking at getting inoculated against COVID-19. And anecdotally, we estimate about 50% of the direct support workforce is reluctant to get the vaccine. And we're hoping that this webinar will help you make those decisions because the vaccines are safe and are effective. Now, compounding that issue, that the DSPs are anxious about taking this vaccine, scarred by a history of being mistreated, is something that's very, very important to us. The providers, the organizations that support people with disabilities, the organizations that employ direct support professionals are also anxious about the people that they serve. And they've been scarred by many thousands of deaths in the past year. Hospitals and nursing homes and IDD providers of services are desperate to have their employees vaccinated. That is the issue. The DSPs are reluctant. The DSPs are concerned. They're afraid. They've got reasons to be concerned and afraid. But the employers, the executives, the managers of these organizations desperately want to make sure that their DSPs are vaccinated and safe, and the people that they support are vaccinated and safe. And as you'll hear later on, people with disabilities are much more vulnerable to this horrible disease and 3 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than the typical population. So that's why we're doing this today. The anxiety around a new vaccine and the need to get back to normal, the need to get some semblance of everyday life for people who have been separated from community for the past year and a long history of being separated from community in their lives. So that's why we're doing it today. But let's give a little bit of context as well. We need to know, you need to know just more than the facts. I think we need to answer your questions. We absolutely need to answer your questions. We need to give you clear, understandable information. That's why we're doing this. But that's not enough. We need to give you the facts, but we also need to hear you. Your employers need to hear you. We need to acknowledge that you are fearful of, many of you are fearful of this vaccine, and understand why. So we can begin to build this trust. You know, a mistrust between direct support professionals and management is not new. It's been around a long time. We've done webinars on it. We talk about it a lot, and we want to kind of break down that mistrust between direct support professionals and, as many direct support professionals will call it, the higher ups, right, John, the higher ups. I think getting this information is critically important at this time. John? But here's some interesting information. In order to really understand where the workforce is coming from, and people with disabilities and their families are also concerned about this vaccine. We have a rather dubious history in research around people with disabilities. For example, the Willowbrook State School hepatitis studies in the 50s and 60s, where people with disabilities who lived in the largest state-operated institution in this country were injected with live hepatitis. It was clear that that research was done to benefit others at the expense of people with disabilities. That can't happen anymore. Of course that doesn't happen anymore. And as Mark will probably talk about, in order to have human subjects of any research, you have to go through rigorous approval processes to test anything on humans. Beyond that, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was also a highly unethical research study that was conducted for 40 years, injecting syphilis into Black males, Black men, and wondering why the Black community is reluctant to get this vaccine. Our history teaches us a lot. So we need to be respectful of that. We need to understand why a direct support workforce, of which 60% of them are minorities, may be reluctant to get a vaccine. So that's some context for you. I'm going to try to keep my mouth quiet and allow the experts to talk. But I'm going to go back one more, John. I want to end with this one thought. The title of that article was Cash, Breakfasts, and Firings. Is clearly not the answer. The article, and I hope you read it, will also talk about how organizations are so desperate to get their workforce vaccinated is that they're offering cash incentives, taking people out for breakfast, and threatening to fire them. That is no way to get this done. Clearly not the answer. The answer, my friends, is facts, understanding, and partnership. Some of you were going to say is blowing in the wind, but facts, understanding, and partnership is the answer here. So I hope that today's webinar gives you the information that you need to make a good decision and to understand that this vaccine is not only safe, but it's critically important for us to receive this vaccine to get to normal. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much for that setup and table setting. I get the honor of introducing our doctors. We are so lucky. Some of you know Dr. Rader. I'm going to introduce him in a second, but first I'm going to introduce Joe's brother. But more so, what's more important for this webinar is his brother's expertise. I'd like to introduce Mark Macbeth, Dr. Mark Macbeth, PhD. Professor Macbeth earned his bachelor's degree in biological sciences from the University of Vermont and his doctorate in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of Chicago. His 20 years of experience in the field of RNA biochemistry. I have no idea what that is. We're going to learn about what that is. Trust me, trust me. But his 20 years experience in this field began with his doctoral thesis on how messenger RNA is translated into protein. Again, don't worry, he's going to explain that. His specific research interests include the study of molecules that can change the sequence and structure of this thing called messenger RNA and the effects of these changes on the nervous system. He is currently an assistant professor at Butler University, where he teaches chemistry, biochemistry, their affiliated laboratories. And this spring semester, he's teaching a course on the development of the SARS messenger RNA vaccine. And again, he'll explain all this. He and his research team of 6 undergraduate students are developing a testing program to detect the antibodies to the SARS-CoV-2 virus in students, faculty, and university staff. And I'm glad I was able to read that because I don't understand half of that. But Mark, welcome and thank you. Next, our friend, our colleague, and certainly a mentor to me and to Joe, is our medical advisor at the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals, Dr. Rick Rader. So Dr. Rader is the director of the Habilitation Center at Orange Grove Center, that's in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where for the last 24 years, he's been responsible for the creation, implementation, and evaluation of novel programs in healthcare delivery for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. He's the Vice President for Public Policy and Advocacy at the American Academy of Developmental Medicine and Dentistry, AADMD, which we are very proud partners with. And he serves as editor-in-chief of Exceptional Parent magazine. Dr. Rader is the Senior Global Advisor for Inclusive Health Innovation at Special Olympics International, and he's also the Medical Advisor to the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals. He sits with us all the time and advises us. Dr. Rader is a member of the steering committee at the National Task Group for Intellectual Disabilities and Dementia Practices, and is a member of the National Council on Disability. So, doctors, thank you for being with us. We're privileged to have you. Let's get to this. Before we get to the questions that you have given us, Dr. Macbeth is going to give us kind of a 101 on immunity and this thing called RNA. So, Mark, without any further ado, to you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Joe, for inviting me to do this. I think it's a really important subject. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to give you basically a 2-year course in biochemistry condensed in 5 to 10 minutes. So buckle up. You probably heard about this vaccine, this new type of vaccine for the coronavirus, or that causes COVID. It's an RNA vaccine, uses RNA technology. And so in order to, explain some facts about this vaccine, I thought I would step back and explain to you what RNA is and what it does, how it's used as a vaccine, and how we're going to develop this vaccine to prevent infection from the coronavirus that causes COVID. So you may have all have heard of DNA. DNA is the instruction manual, basically, for who you are, for who we are. We all have a unique DNA sequences. Our siblings and relatives have some overlapping DNA. That's why I sort of look like my brother Joe. It doesn't account for hair length or personal choices like this, but it does account for hair color, face shape, height, all of these other sort of characteristics that we might have in common. And so DNA is written in a special code, and that code has to be transmitted to a protein. Okay, so the DNA basically is the language that we are using to define who we are, but that language has to be translated into proteins, because proteins are basically doing all the work and the functional molecules. That translation is done by another type of molecule called RNA. So that flow of information from DNA to protein goes through an RNA intermediate, where RNA basically acts as the translator. It translates that DNA language into the language of a protein. And humans are very complex organisms, complicated. We have more than 10,000, probably closer to 20,000 different DNA sequences that are encoded by our genes that make us who we are. And each of those genes encode a specific protein. And it goes through that translation process for which RNA is used to translate them. So we have 20,000 genes making 20,000 different proteins. The coronavirus is very clever. It bypasses that DNA. It doesn't store all of its genes in DNA, it stores them in RNA. So it already is translated. So when we're infected by a coronavirus, we don't have to go through that translation process to translate that coronavirus gene into a coronavirus protein. It's already an RNA molecule. Also, coronavirus is very clever. It can survive with only 30 genes. It's very simple, right? There's 30 different RNA sequences that make about 30 different proteins, okay? But it needs all of those proteins, all 30 of them, to make a new virus and to go on and to infect, spread to somebody else, to basically make a copy of itself. And so it needs all 30 of them. And this is where the vaccine comes in. The vaccine, again, it's sort of a very simple type of vaccine. And when we compare to other types, you'll see why. The vaccine is basically one of those coronavirus sequences, one of those RNA sequences of the coronavirus. So it has the instructions for just one of those coronavirus proteins, and that protein is called the spike protein. The spike protein is on the surface of the virus. It's these little studs that you see in all of the pictures of the virus, and on this one here, it's those little black circles that are on the coat of the virus. And so when we're given an injection in the arm, a shot in the arm of this vaccine, of this RNA, that RNA goes into our cells where it is then copied into that coronavirus protein. So we're not getting injected with the entire coronavirus. We're just getting it injected with that instructions for that one spike protein. And we're missing the other 29 instructions to make the rest of the virus. Okay, so that's really important. And that's one of the reasons why we're not going to get coronavirus when we're injected with this vaccine. We don't have the instructions for the entire virus. We just have the instructions for that one spike protein. Okay, and so again, we get that shot. Our cells start making that spike protein, but then what happens next? And then go to the next slide, John. So when we start making that spike protein, that's when our immune response kicks in. When we're infected with a coronavirus, that spike protein goes into our system and we start an immune response against it. The same thing happens when we're injected with that RNA for that spike protein. We start making that spike protein and the immune response kicks in. The body is almost tricked into thinking that we were exposed to the actual virus, but we weren't. We were just exposed to just that spike protein, but we were exposed intentionally, okay? Again, completely safe because we're missing the instructions for the rest of the coronavirus. Okay, and so when we talk about the immune response that kicks in against the spike protein, we have two types of immunity. We have one type called innate immunity. This is the immediate response. The body immediately recognizes that, hey, something doesn't belong here. We don't normally make this spike protein. We need to get rid of it. Okay, that is not human, right? It's not, a host. And so the innate immune response kicks in immediately to try and destroy this, or to ward this infectious protein off, this particle, this spike protein. And so that happens right away. And it's basically the body throwing the kitchen sink at this spike protein. And it's responsible for all of our symptoms. And so when we feel that soreness in the arm, if we feel a little feverish or a little achy when we get this injection, that's because of this innate immune response kicking in. Okay? It's kicking in the same way it would kick in if we were actually exposed to the virus. All of those symptoms we feel when we get an infection, a stuffy nose, a fever, aches and pains, a soreness, or a headache, that's all due to the innate immune response. So when you feel those side effects from a vaccination, that means the vaccine is working. It means your body is making that spike protein from that RNA from the coronavirus, and your immune response is starting to fight it off. Okay, so that's the innate immune response. And again, it's immediate. It's, within a day of getting that injection. The next point, though, is the adaptive immune response. And this is key for immunity and preventing reinfection at a later date. And so the adaptive immune response, it kicks in 3 to 4 weeks after you are exposed. Okay, this is after the innate immune response. And the key player in the adaptive immune response is an antibody. And an antibody is a protein, one of our own proteins now, that will recognize the foreign protein, that spike protein on the coronavirus. And it's going to target it for destruction, but it's going to do it very, very specifically now. Those antibodies are only recognizing that spike protein, right? They're not recognizing anything else. So it's very specific, and it takes 3 to 4 weeks for this to happen. So in addition to targeting the spike protein for destruction, it's sending signals to other immune cells to start making more of that antibody. So you can build up a reserve of them. So that is, if you're ever re-exposed at a later date, you'll have some antibodies ready to put up a fight right away, and you won't get sick. Okay? So those antibodies will respond right away when you're re-exposed, 3 or 4 months down the road, and ward off that infection in a very specific and very potent way. And so this is responsible, this is what we call immunity, when we are immune to a virus or a disease. It's because we've built up these antibodies. So in addition to having these antibodies around, our cells that make them, they also remember how to make them. So we can have this immunity that could last for years and years. And so immunity to measles, if you had a measles vaccine, that can last up to 70 years because our cells that make those antibodies remember how to do that. So if we're ever re-exposed to a measles virus, we can make those antibodies right away and fight off that infection. Not all vaccines last for 70 years. Tetanus lasts for 10 years. The flu vaccine, because the flu changes so quickly, and we'll talk about changes in new strains of virus later, the flu vaccine, because it changes so quickly, it lasts for about 1 year. Okay? And so that's the innate and the adaptive immune response. Both of them are key players in the vaccination and developing immunity. But the last concept I want to talk about is this idea of herd immunity. And herd immunity is defined by the Center for Disease Control as a situation where a large enough percentage of the population is immune to an infectious disease. And that makes it spread to non-immune individuals or susceptible individuals unlikely. And I like to think of this as an analogy, right? So think about a calf that's part of a herd, and that herd is going to be attacked by a predator. What the herd does, the adults in the herd, they will surround the calf to protect it because the calf can't fight off the predator on its own. The same idea happens with herd immunity, is that you have a population of individuals that are immune that are serving to protect those that are not immune. And this works because a virus needs a host to copy itself and to spread to somebody else. But if enough of the population is immune, that virus can't get a foothold and spread to other individuals, and it eventually dies out. And we've seen this happen. A perfect example of this is smallpox. The smallpox virus has basically been eradicated because of herd immunity. We went on a huge vaccination program was developed to vaccinate everybody in the world to develop this herd immunity, right? So now the virus had nowhere to go, and it just basically went extinct. It died off. And so that's what we're trying to establish with this coronavirus vaccine. We want to get enough of the population immune so the virus can no longer get a foothold and spread to other individuals, right? It just doesn't have anywhere to go. Okay, so again, that was a lot of information thrown at you. Hopefully it sort of set the table for what this vaccine is about. You get a little bit about RNA, you get a little bit about the immune response. And we're happy to take your questions about safety and other issues regarding this vaccine. So I'll turn it back to you, John.
Mark, thank you. My goodness. Thank you for encapsulating, 2 years of study into 10 minutes. These calendars, I think maybe you want to address these now, or do you want to wait?
Yeah, I can talk about them right now. So one of the questions, and it may come up, but I'll deal with it now. One of the common questions that we're getting is once I get the vaccine, when will I be protected, right, from the coronavirus? And so you can see here, it's if the vaccine was administered on the first day of a month, you are still very susceptible for about 2 weeks. Okay, so do not mess around. Keep your distance. Keep your masks on. But after about 2 weeks, you're going to start. You'll feel those side effects. You might feel a sore arm. But after about those 2 weeks, you're going to start making those antibodies that are going to build up, and they're going to start to protect you from reinfection. And they start after about 3 weeks or so. You start making those. Okay. After about a month, you should have plenty of them. And what's going to help that is getting a booster shot of after about 3 weeks, I believe it is, for one of them, for one of the RNA vaccines. So you'll get your first shot. About 3 weeks later, you'll get a second shot. And then that should set you up for a while. We don't know how long yet, but you should be protected after about a month. One of the questions that also comes up is, why do you need a second shot? And this comes up with, it sort of deals with the beauty of the RNA vaccine. Not only is it simple and safe, RNA by itself is, and having worked with it for so long, RNA is just not very stable. And that makes it very challenging to work with, right? And very frustrating, but it also makes it a great vaccine, because when you're injected, that RNA is going to degrade within a day or so. The spike proteins that are going to be made from it, they're going to last a little bit longer, long enough for you to make those antibodies. But because that RNA is so unstable, you're going to get another booster after about 3 weeks to just sort of, charge up the system again. Here's another shot of RNA. Why don't you telling your body to make more of that coronavirus spike protein so you can sort of shore up the production of those antibodies. Okay. And that instability of the RNA, it makes it a great vaccine. It doesn't affect your DNA. Once that DNA was copied to RNA, that's sort of a one-way street. So you don't have any worries about that. But also you may have heard that this vaccine needs to be stored at very cold temperatures, -80 degrees, frozen, deep frozen. That's because of the stability of the RNA. It's just not very stable, and it needs to be stashed away at these ultra cold temperatures to make it last a little bit longer. So yeah, so give it about a month where you should see this 94 to 95% effectiveness.
That's great, Mark. That's great. Thank you. Here we go. These are questions that came to us from you when you registered for this webinar, and we're going to answer as many of them as we can. They're themed. Each of the doctors will address a different question. Let's get right to it. Remember, these are your questions, so hopefully we're going to answer them to your benefit. Dr. Macbeth, we'll start with you. Why was this vaccine available so quickly while other vaccines have taken years?
Yep. So traditionally, vaccines were made from basically viruses themselves. You were getting injected with the virus, but the virus was either dead or inactivated, so it wouldn't make you sick. Those are very difficult to make, very challenging. The technology to make the RNA vaccine is very simple. It's, my brother sort of joked with me over the holidays and asked me, why didn't you come up with it if it's so easy to do? right? And yes, I'm kicking myself because it's such a foundational process, very simple process to make, with the proper training and everything. But yeah, it's just the technology to make the RNA is very straightforward. All we have to do is make the RNA that's going to make that, give the instructions for that one spike protein, and that's really all there is. We have to package that RNA, but that's some simple chemistry that was done. But it was very quick, and it's just such a simple vaccine and a simple idea. The other sort of reason why it was available so quickly is the amount of resources that were thrown at it. There was a lot of people power that went into developing this and testing it in clinical trials. A lot of resources, a lot of money was thrown at this. And, there was a need. We needed to move fast. This virus was killing people, too many people. And so we needed to move quickly. But I want to sort of emphasize, no corners were cut. We went through all of the regulatory processes to develop this and to ensure that it was safe for distribution.
I would just add to this. This is probably the most common question that we received. This is the biggest concern out there from the direct support workforce. Why is this so? Why was this done so quickly? So thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Dr. Rader, thank you. Thank you for being here. Dr. Rader, why shouldn't I wait until just after this first, this first phase of people goes? Why shouldn't I do it? Let me just wait. Why shouldn't people wait, doctor?
Good question. I want to first disclose to you that I have been vaccinated against COVID. I will be receiving my second shot this Sunday, and my wife promised to take me for ice cream after. My wife is also a physician, and she has been totally vaccinated with both shots. In fact, everyone in my immediate family has been or will be vaccinated. In terms of side effects, so far I don't have any hair on my palms, and I'm not growing gills on my neck, so far so good. And while I certainly don't mean to downplay or minimize the potential for side effects, sometimes a little humor goes a long way. I'm also a COVID survivor. I was quarantined for 2 weeks and luckily did not have any symptoms or any new onset problems, but I certainly appreciated the concerns, the depression, the anxiety, and the second guessing that this pandemic causes individuals and families. So why shouldn't you just wait? Well, we know there was a large number of people waiting to see how the first wave of vaccinated people are doing, so-called canary in the coal mine. One worry people have is, will there be long-term side effects and over the months and years to come? And while we can never fully exclude the possibility, it's going to be rare. Our mathematical models show that it might be 1 in 100 million. The chances of long-term complications are extremely unlikely because of how vaccines work. Most of the work of the vaccines, the jobs of vaccines, are done in the first few days, then the vaccine is gone from the body. So what's left is nothing more than your immune response to the vaccine. As Dr. Macbeth has explained, these vaccines use mRNA, the first vaccines to use such technology. And it's interesting to note that the M stands for messenger. The RNA just serves to tip off the body about what potentially might be coming over the hill. They have the potential to be the safest. Most existing vaccines use inactivated or dead viruses, but this new method avoids that entirely. We don't actually have to use the pathogen itself, and basically that is almost 100% capacity for no problems. Before a vaccine is licensed for use in all populations, all of those steps have to be completed. One of the reasons, as Dr. Macbeth said, we have consolidated some of the multi-steps that had to be done separately, and now we do them in unison. But getting the vaccine is obviously a personal decision, but it should be based on fact, not emotions or misinformation. The risk of waiting far outweigh the risk of getting vaccinated. While you are waiting and encouraging others to wait, you are putting yourself and people around you at risk. The reality is that COVID has a repertoire of severe, disabling, possibly lifelong defects in what appears to be every organ system in the body. Your waiting will also impact on us achieving herd immunity, which Dr. Macbeth has explained, which will protect those of us who cannot be vaccinated for legitimate medical reasons. So while it is a personal choice, none of us live on an island. None of us live in a vacuum. Our actions, especially DSPs, have direct impact on those around us.
Thank you, Doc. That's great. That's great. Dr. Macbeth, can someone who tested positive for COVID-19 still get the vaccine?
Yep, it's recommended that even if you've tested positive, like Dr. Rader mentioned, he has still received the vaccine. It's there's not going to be any harm in getting it again. And again, you have you will not. There's no potential for catching the virus from getting this vaccine. So absolutely, if you test positive, you should still get it.
Great.
Yeah.
Dr. Rader, Doc, is it safe for kids and for adults with disabilities specifically? Those kind of two.
Another good question. Well, regarding the safety of the vaccine for children with and without disabilities, we still don't know for sure because they haven't been part of the clinical trials. We'll probably be starting to study the vaccine and its impact on children under the age of 18 later this summer. Disability alone may not be related to higher risk for getting COVID or having severe illness. Most people with disabilities are not inherently at higher risk for becoming infected with or having severe illness from COVID. However, some people with disabilities might be at a higher risk of infection or severe illness because of their underlying medical conditions. We call this co-occurring or comorbidities. All people seem to be at higher risk of severe illness from COVID if they have serious underlying chronic medical conditions like chronic lung disease, heart disease, or a weakened immune system. Adults with disabilities are 3 times more likely than adults without disabilities to have heart disease, stroke, diabetes, or cancer than adults without. And those are the things that basically are throw gas on the fire. People with specific types of disabilities might be at increased risk for getting COVID. And basically we look at those as in 3 classifications. First of all, people with limited mobility cannot avoid coming into close contact with others who may be infected, such as direct support professionals and family members. Also, we have people with low health literacy, people who have trouble understanding information, and therefore they have difficulty in realizing why they're practicing these preventative measures, such as hand washing and social distancing. And also people who may not be able to communicate symptoms of illness. DSPs know better than anybody the difficulty that our individuals have in expressing their discomfort, their pain, their emotions, etc. One of the roles of the DSP is to interpret those particular units. So if there was a cloud with a silver lining, it might be that the pandemic has dramatically demonstrated the need to recognize and support the legions of DSPs, frontline workers that have been invisible and taken for granted for decades.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Dr. Macbeth, will this be a yearly shot, like the seasonal flu shot?
Yep, that's a good question. So the seasonal flu shot, it's given every year because the flu virus, the virus that causes flu, it changes so quickly. It changes rapidly. So we have to develop a new version of that flu shot every year. The coronavirus, just in its nature, it doesn't change as quickly as the flu. It does. It can. We can get new strains, and there's a new strain that's around the corner right now. My hunch is that it will not need to be given every year, but we can't know for sure. The SARS virus, the antibodies that were generated against the original SARS virus in the early 2000s, those antibodies last about 3 years against that. And so my hunch is that this version of the virus will be about the same, at least 3 to 5 years. And so I don't think you will need a yearly shot. But again, we can't know for sure because we're just so early in the pandemic and early, and it's such a new or novel virus, we just don't know about it. And I should say about those new strains, all of the information that we have so far indicates that these vaccines, the current RNA vaccines, are effective against these new strains. And so just to put you at ease about those. The good news is because of this, the ease in which, the relative ease in which these vaccines are developed using this RNA technology, we would be able to develop a new vaccine very, very quickly if the need arises.
Great. That's Dr. Rader, once we receive the vaccine, can we still transmit the virus to others? And how long are we going to be protected?
Well, first to the question of can vaccinated people still transmit the virus to others? The vaccine trials test for efficacy, that is, whether or not a vaccine protects a participant from contracting a specific disease, in this case, COVID-19. But trials do not look at whether a person could still be infectious, still be able to give the disease to other people after receiving the vaccine. We just don't know the answer to that question because that question was not addressed during the clinical trials. Many existing vaccines reduce transmission, but that doesn't necessarily mean the coronavirus vaccine will. In the absence of any information, it's safe to assume that having antibodies won't protect you from shedding the virus. You can still have residual active viruses in the nose and the throat, and they can be basically contained by a mucus film. It's doubtful whether or not the antibodies can penetrate that mucus film. So while you still have those in your nose and your throat, you can certainly transmit them. Achieving herd immunity will ultimately rely on whether or not and to what extent the vaccine keeps people from being infectious. We will need some other studies that are currently being underway to tell us whether or not it is keeping people from becoming infected. How long will we be protected? Well, the first people to get the new vaccine back in March in the initial safety trials are still protected. So that's a minimum of 9 months. Fingers crossed, 3 to 4 years. That would be consistent with the animal data we have on other coronavirus vaccines. I realize that 3 to 4 years doesn't sound very long, but in the middle of the pandemic, that's an eternity.
Thank you, Dr. Macbeth. These vaccines cover the newly emerging variants of the virus. You kind of covered that. But...
Yep. It seems like they will. All the information from Pfizer that we have now indicates that they are going to cover those new variants. That does not to say another variant could arise that it might not work against. But again, the technology that we used is so straightforward. It would be very easy to develop a new vaccine that could work against this, or that would work against this. So yeah, that's a great question.
Dr. Rader, is this vaccine tested on people with intellectual disabilities? If not, why would we think it would work on them? That's an ethical question.
Well, for one thing, the virus probably doesn't really know, and the vaccine doesn't know whether or not what is the IQ of the individual's arm. The vaccine was not tested on subjects with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They are traditionally excluded from participating in clinical trials. Up to 60% of the US population is comprised of people who are typically not included in clinical trials. This includes children, the elderly, pregnant women, and people with intellectual or physical disabilities. Most of these exclusions were based on the World War II Nazi medical experiments that used children and people with disabilities. After the war, there were many rules, regulations, and mandates that prohibited those at-risk groups from being experimented on. A lot had to do with their capacity to give consent to be part of the study groups. While protecting the vulnerable population is ethical and moral, there is a downside to excluding them, and it's that we don't really fully understand how drugs react and respond medically to these individuals. Even with regularly prescribed medications, we are not positive with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities how much medication is required, how long the medication will last, how the drug is excreted or cleared from the body. So prescribing drugs for this population is not an exact science. We are now reconsidering including these groups in clinical trials. We also don't use people with chronic medical conditions on the drug trials, but most adults have a chronic condition. Many have multiple chronic conditions. Approximately 66% of adults on Medicare have 2 or more chronic conditions, and 15% have 6 or more. For instance, the 2 vaccine companies are beginning to study the vaccine on children. Right now, the vaccine is not recommended for children under the age of 18. We are now looking to see whether or not it's appropriate for children 12 to 17, but it will probably be not approved for children under the age of 12. The same holds true for minorities in clinical trials. The reality is that we must include all cross-sections of the population in drug trials to ensure that we fully understand any differences in the way different races react and respond to different drugs.
Yeah, Joe.
Yeah, I want either Mark or Dr. Rader to respond to this. The second part of the most popular question is, or concern is that it wasn't tested enough. Pfizer and Moderna, I'm sure they went through certain, Mark said there was no corners cut. How many people were tested with these vaccines?
So from, I believe it was the Pfizer vaccine, they tested more than 35, there were more than 35,000 participants in the test. 18,000 of them received the vaccine. Another 18,000 of them received a placebo or a mock injection of saline. So yeah, it's a pretty large number, a very large study in that, what we call a phase 3 trial, an actual live human study.
There is also mathematical models called predictive analysis, in which you can extrapolate information from a small group without actually examining the larger group.
Mhm.
Good. That's good. Yes, we got about 10 minutes. We got some questions to get through here. Try to get through all of them. Dr. Rader, this is a biggie. What if my religious beliefs go against receiving the vaccine?
I was praying Dr. Macbeth would get that question. Well, for one thing, in terms of your religious beliefs go against receiving the vaccine, let me state that you don't need a reason, basically, to reject getting a vaccine. That question dovetails into the question is, what if I am required by my employer to get the vaccine and I have a religious obligation against it? Well, there are two reasons why you may be exempt from receiving the vaccine. One is based on medical and disability related conditions, and the other one on religious beliefs. The Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, has a provision that if you have a legitimate medical condition that prohibits you from getting the vaccine, you don't have to get it. Your employee has an obligation to make a reasonable accommodation for you to continue your work, possibly at home. Unfortunately, as a DSP, we don't work remotely. We don't work from home. The other reason to be exempt is based on Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that includes your religious beliefs. You can say your religious beliefs do not permit you to receive the vaccine. You don't have to believe in God, and you don't have to demonstrate that you belong to any specific church or congregation. You can simply declare that for ethical, moral, or religious reasons, you are against the vaccine. That being said, let me tell you that none of the major religions of the world have any specific mandates against vaccines. The majority of religions support healthcare through medical research and discovery. Even the Pope of the Catholic Church has recently given permission to use vaccines that might have been developed through the use of electively aborted fetuses, provided that all other avenues of treatment have been explored, tried, and failed. Religions promote science and have expanded their views to emphasize the importance of protecting the public in pandemics like the current COVID one. But be reminded that personal or political reasons to reject vaccines are not defendable or accepted by the EEOC.
Great. That's a great answer. Thank you. Very important question. Dr. Rader, again, what are some other conditions that would not be recommended to receive the vaccine? Like high blood pressure, diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. Any advice against getting the vaccine?
The conditions that we say are contraindicated are coming from the CDC. And basically, they advise that any individual who has a severe allergic reaction to any of the ingredients in the COVID vaccine not get inoculated. People who have had a severe allergic reaction to other types of vaccines or injectable therapies should talk with their doctor about what would be best. And those with a history of allergic reactions that aren't related to vaccines, like food, bee stings, venom, pets, and latex, can still get vaccinated. If a person has a severe allergic reaction to the first shot, basically the CDC advises them not to get the second shot. And those without a history of severe allergic reactions will be observed for 15 minutes upon getting the first vaccine. And the CDC advises that those with a history of severe allergic reactions be observed for 30 minutes. There's no data on the safety of the COVID vaccine in pregnant people, as they were excluded from the clinical trials. But based on current knowledge, experts believe that the messenger RNA vaccines are unlikely to pose a risk for the present person or the lactating mother. There's no data on the safety, but but basically there's no contraindications. Clinical trials suggest the vaccine is safe for people who have already been infected with COVID-19, such as myself. Then the other question is, what have you received the antibodies as a treatment? The so-called convalescent antibody treatment, plasma. The rule of thumb based on the decay curve of those injected antibodies is about 90 days. So if you've received those antibodies as a treatment, wait 3 months and then you can get vaccinated. Also, people who have underlying medical conditions can receive the vaccine safely if they have no contraindications for vaccines across the board. We don't have any data on immunocompromised people or people with HIV, but basically those people are at high risk, and so they are recommended to get the vaccine. But it's possible that the impact of the vaccine won't be as effective on people that are immunocompromised. So that's we're waiting to see. The Moderna vaccine is authorized for use in people 18 and older, and the Pfizer vaccine is authorized for use in those 16 and older. At this time, the COVID-19 vaccine has not been studied in children, and they are not authorized to receive the vaccine.
Thank you. That's comprehensive. Thank you. Dr. Rader, you again. Should we continue to wear all the gloves, the gowns, the masks, all the PPE, even after we get the vaccine?
I'm afraid yes. Don't leave home without it. Realistically, the immunity is not achieved immediately after the vaccine, and the vaccine won't be available to everyone at the same time. So even after high-risk individuals and other groups are vaccinated, you still got to do measures like mask wearing and basically social distancing. I think we should be prepared to wear masks for the foreseeable future, possibly into next year, certainly the third quarter of 2021, when they expect to really be able to vaccinate large numbers of the general public. Although the vaccine seems to be highly effective, it won't result in immunity for everyone. We basically have a 95% effective rating, but that leaves 5% of the population where the vaccine may not become effective. So basically, you have these small groups of people that will not be protected either by themselves or through transmission, and therefore it becomes very, very important for the rest of us until herd immunity is realized and achieved to continue using the CDC guidelines of safety.
Got 2 more questions. And, here we go. When's the vaccine going to be available for DSPs, Doc? We're hearing it all over. When am I going to get it?
Well, in 2 words, right now. The medical establishment has finally realized what DSPs do. They're getting an understanding into what you do exactly. They now understand just how direct support professionals are. It's a 24-hour up close and personal interaction that cannot be done remotely or by technology alone. While it's up to the states to create the allocation and distribution plans relating to COVID vaccine, virtually every state has made the DSP a priority and placed them in phase 1, along with the individuals they support. This was not always at the beginning, and basically through the efforts of the NADSP, AADMD, and Anchor, we brought it to the attention of the CDC that you cannot let these DSPs wait. The recommendation for you being a 1A high priority comes from the highest medical advisory group at the Centers for Disease Control, and that's the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. They have decided that DSPs are not only on the front lines, but they will be on the front lines after this pandemic has been defeated. They know that protecting DSPs now ensure that they will be there to continue to support the complex needs of the underserved and high-risk populations. They are beginning to understand that the DSP may even be more significant than first responders. First responders are there when the situation becomes critical and chaotic. Direct support professionals are not waiting on the sidelines to be called into action. They're constantly in action. They work to reduce the need for first responders. So if you have not been scheduled to receive your vaccination, contact your supervisor. If you are not a priority in your state, reach me through the NADSP. I know a guy.
He knows a guy. Here we go. We got 3 minutes left. Mark, you get to bring us home. Hey, Mark, you only got 3 minutes. Not even 2 minutes. When is this going to be all over, buddy?
Okay. Oh boy, I don't know what normal is anymore. You know, it's as Dr. Rader said, we're going to be wearing masks. We're going to be washing our hands all the time. We're going to be keeping our distance each other for the foreseeable future, probably through the summer, probably a little bit longer. We need to get this thing under control. We need to get people vaccinated. We need to establish this herd immunity. And we need to show that this, as Dr. Rader said, just because you receive the vaccine, you will be protected, but you may still be able to transmit it. We need to show that we're not going to be transmitting it anymore. And so, gosh, you know, I see things sort of, I see them improving, you know, every day that goes by. I feel more hopeful, more people are getting vaccinated. But again, probably through the summer at least, through the autumn more likely, and maybe even a year from now, things will start getting back to normal, restaurants opening up, masks going away. So knock on wood, let's hope sooner than later, yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Doctors, thank you. You have been wonderful, and we appreciate your knowledge and your facts very much. Joe.
So, and again, thank you, Dr. Rader. Every time we ask Dr. Rader to help us out, he's always there 100% of the time. And for the rest of the community that we work with, now you know why our father is favorite is Mark Macbeth, because he's so smart. We are very concerned about your health. We're also concerned about the health of the people that you support. We have a professional obligation to carry ourselves and conduct ourselves with professionalism, both at work and outside of work. And if you're outside of work, please wear your mask, please social distance, read our code of ethics, engage with our code of ethics. You have an ethical responsibility to, as Dr. Rader says, be that P, the professional outside of work. In fact, John is doing a webinar on the code of ethics with our dear friend Dave Hingsberger on January 27th, and you can register for that free webinar on our website. Do it now. It's going to be a fantastic thing, and we're going to talk about your responsibility outside of work. So wear your mask, please. And I think after all of this, with all of the information that we've given you, you can make an informed decision yourself about whether to get this vaccine or not. And I think there's a preponderance of evidence that it is safe and effective. So one other thing that we're doing is that we are going to be conducting some virtual trainings. Your organizations are very important to us, and we want to make sure that your organizations have a culture of competency, that we are developing direct support professionals in a way that uses the code of ethics and understands the competency areas that are required for a DSP to be a skilled practitioner. Because there's research in the work that you do. So join us on February 24th, where John and our colleague Dan Hermrich is going to be doing a virtual training on creating that culture of direct support competency. Lastly, if you want to get in touch with us, this is our contact information. We are so honored to be able to do this with you, to give you the full information, because the work that you do, it makes a world of difference in people's lives. Again, Dr. Rader, can't thank you enough. Mark Macbeth, dinner is on me next time we get together. Thank you so much. And John, your skilled facilitation is always appreciated. So thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you to everyone for all their great questions and for having me on.
Thank you.
Thank you.